recession is here. Interest rates are still high, inflation is still high. It's a story that feels very familiar, but don't be fooled. This is not 2008. In this video, I'm breaking down exactly what is happening in the economy, why this is not 2008 all over again, and what you can do to be prepared for the storm that is about to hit the economy. But first, my name is Tiffany. I'm a loan officer here in Las Vegas, Nevada. I've helped over 200 families with their real estate needs and would love to help you with yours. If you're interested in working together on buying a home, refinancing a home, maybe taking out some equity, I'm going to leave my information in the description down below so we can connect, maybe find a time to chat and see how I can best serve you. As well, this is a growing channel and I greatly appreciate everyone who's been subscribing, commenting, liking the videos. I've had some videos blow up here a little bit, recently, so I greatly appreciate everyone who's been showing some love to the channel, and I hope to continue making this style of content for you guys. So if you enjoy watching some up-to-date news about what's happening in the economy, you want to maybe learn more about buying a home, then I highly recommend you subscribe to this channel and like it so I can reach more people who are also looking for that kind of information. But with that being said, let's get into today's video. So let's talk about what's actually going on here, because it's starting to get a little weird out here. We're seeing major layoffs in tech, we're seeing the IRS making cuts, we're seeing major consulting firms making cuts, finance companies making cuts. We're seeing a lot of companies that are starting to trim the fat per se and start to get really lean with their workforce, which is pretty alarming considering that we're not even technically in a recession yet, at least by economist standards, but you're starting to see companies make this move now. You would think that this would make inflation a little bit lower, but that's actually not the case. Inflation is actually still a problem and will likely to continue to be a problem as these tariffs that Donald Trump is enacting start to see its effect in the marketplace. In fact, at the time of me filming this, there is a plan set in motion for China to be hit with a 104% tariff on any goods imported into the US. So those goods that you go into Dollar Tree for that are $1.25 likely could be $2.50 by the time that this video actually comes out. It's alarming to see the change so quickly with inflation and with these tariff situation. A lot of people are really concerned about what these tariffs are going to mean for the economy going forward. In fact, just this week, the CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, released an annual letter to his shareholders that basically talked about the future going forward and what this means for the economy going forward. And he noted that the US economy was already weakening before Donald Trump's sweeping new tariffs. And now those levies will fuel inflation and slow growth. He's also saying there are many uncertainties surrounding the new tariff policy, the potential retaliatory actions, including on services by other countries, the effect on confidence, the impact on investments and capital flows, the effect on corporate profits, and the possible effect on the US dollar. There is a lot of talk about what these tariffs are actually going to mean, and the CEO of JP Morgan is basically saying, hey, it's better for us to figure this out right away and, basically come to an agreement with all of these countries, because if not, then these retaliatory actions that these countries could have to the US can make this even worse and would be extremely hard to reverse once enacted. There is a lot of people who are saying that these tariffs are going to make the economy even worse, especially when it comes to inflation. Which leads me into the next section, the Fed. So the Fed is taking a very slow and cautious approach when it comes to, hey, what are we doing with interest rates? I reported on this back a couple months ago about how the Fed is basically in no hurry to bring down interest rates and how they would rather see a slow cautionary, regression back rather than seeing one steep decrease in interest rates. But the problem is that right now with inflation where it's at, this could create a lot of havoc for people who are wanting to basically invest into the economy, feel good about the economy, etc. Which is exactly what happened in 2020 when rates went to essentially zero. The Fed was basically trying to build back confidence in the American economy, because with COVID happening, a lot of people basically took their money out of the stock market, people basically stopped spending their money, and especially with businesses being shut down, people weren't extraneously spending anymore as they had been, just 6 months prior to COVID happening. The only thing they have control over to basically boost the economy is the federal funds rate, which is what they raise and decrease as we go on. But at the beginning of this year, they basically said, hey, we're not sure how many times we're going to decrease. In fact, we may not even be opposed to raising interest rates depending on where we're going with the economy. Now that we're seeing a lot of this movement from the Trump administration about basically levying these very high tariffs, you're not really seeing the Fed respond to this. In fact, what's interesting is that in an appearance last week, Chair Jerome Powell, who is the federal chair, who basically is the one who delivers the news whether or not they're going to increase interest rates, decrease interest rates, etc., said the central bank remains attentive to the risk of higher inflation stemming from tariffs and will not rush any policy moves. It feels like we don't need to be in a hurry. We're going to have to wait and see how this plays out before we start to make adjustments. He also tells that the Fed is holding steady, at least for now. We think the initial stages of this are going to be the Fed not doing anything. There's a lot of uncertainty. Basically, even though we're seeing the issues rise with inflation and with tariffs, the Fed is saying, hey, you know what? Let's figure out exactly how this is going to go down before we decide if we're going to make any plays on our end about what we do with interest rates. They are basically stating, hey, we're not really going to do anything. In fact, there's actually bets from economists right now about the next Fed meeting, which is set for May 5th, about whether or not they're going to decrease interest rates at all. But what's really interesting here is that everyone that I'm reading articles from is basically stating, hey, we really need to see what happens with these tariffs and how far this goes before the Fed actually decides to make any moves, because we're still about a month out at the time of this filming of the Fed meeting next month. So by the time that happens, where will we be as an economy with these tariffs? How are goods? How expensive are things? There's a very good chance that they may not do anything. The scary thing here is that that's going to impact millions of people, because credit card debt is directly linked to the rate that the Fed charges. Credit card debt is through the roof. And if you don't know, basically the federal funds rate doesn't determine mortgage rates, but your rates on things like credit cards, auto loans, personal loans, etc., that is tied to the federal funds rate. So that is what the Fed is directly impacting every time they decide, hey, are we going to increase interest rates? Or are we going to decrease interest rates, etc.? If they decide to just hold steady with where they're at, credit card rates are extremely tied to this. And what's interesting is that credit card debt is at an all-time high. In fact, it grew by $45 billion in the fourth quarter of 2024, representing a 4% increase from that exact same time the last year. And what's also interesting is that delinquency is up as a result as well. So as we're starting to see these policies being enacted, you're starting to see people in financial positions that are not very beneficial, and that may cause further destruction for the economy at large. If more people are filing bankruptcy, if people are going to short sales or foreclosures, etc., like you're starting to see what that could possibly result in. So I think that that is a red flag. If the Fed decides to do nothing, I anticipate a lot of delinquencies, a lot of bankruptcies. You know, we're already starting to see it on the mortgage side where, you know, missed payments are going up. So that is a red flag there for people who are wanting to watch for the health of the economy. We're starting to see the effects of that already as we are chatting here today. So let's talk about the ugly R word, the elephant in the room. Recession. So a lot of people are saying we're in a recession. A lot of people are saying we're not in a recession, but we're getting there, etc. Let's first talk about what the actual definition of a recession is to see if we're actually there yet. A recession is generally defined as a significant decline in economic activity that lasts for an extended period of time, typically visible across the economy in areas like gross domestic product, employment, consumer spending, industrial production, and retail sales. A common definition that economists go by is at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. But that's not set in stone. That's just something that, you know, for the most part, that's what us nerds that are into finance look for when it comes to, hey, are we in a recession or not? And what's interesting here is that I actually looked this up on ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is stating that we are either in a recession as we stand today, or we're teetering right on the edge of one. So even ChatGPT thinks this recession is here. So a lot of people are concerned about what this means for the economy going forward. If we're in a recession already, or if we're about to head into one, what does this mean going forward? And what I think is interesting to know here is that most people don't usually know we're in a recession until after the fact. Like the definition mentioned, it's 2 consecutive quarters. We look at the GDP, we look at employment, we look at consumer spending, and if it's negative for 2 consecutive quarters, then that's when it gets labeled. So as we're going through it, there's actually no clear indication that we are actually in a recession until someone, looks at GDP later down the line and is like, oh yeah, we were in a recession then. So what can we do with that information in the meantime? Well, we're going to discuss that a little bit later down the line. But let's address the next thought that most people tend to have when they mention that we're in a recession. Is this 2008 all over again? So is this actually 2008 again? No. It's not. And there's a couple different reasons for it, but first let's dive into what actually happened in 2008. Give us a better idea of where we're at now and if those two compare. In 2008, the economic crisis was caused because there was a lot of bad mortgage loans on the marketplace. Basically, you could get a loan just for having, a signature basically to put on a piece of paper. Like, there was really no proof needed that you could pay this mortgage loan. There was really no verification done if there was any back-end things that you were maybe lying about. For the most part, you could have any kind of property you wanted, you could pay whatever you wanted, and they would just charge you on the back end and charge you this huge payment on the back end. The issue here is that because there wasn't a requirement to prove that you could pay this loan, a lot of times people were getting loans that they actually really couldn't afford. And, they just happened to have a heartbeat and was able to get a loan with a really high interest rate, maybe really terrible terms. They were able to go about their lives and have a home, basically. But what people don't realize about the home buying process is that when you go to ABC Bank and you want to buy a house with ABC Bank, they're going to finish the loan, you're going to have a mortgage, etc. And then what they're going to do is actually sell that loan to someone else. But it's not quite as simple as just like, hey, I'm going to sell Mr. and Mrs. Smith loan to this other bank, etc. Usually what happens is those loans get packaged together based on very common traits. Basically, if you have very similar credit scores, they get packaged together into what's called mortgage-backed securities. The banks that have these will sell them to whoever is basically interested in real estate as an investment. So a lot of times it was hedge funds, it's maybe, mom and pop corporate offices, maybe it's, other investors, etc. They'll sell them to whoever's interested in that as an investment. But at this time, a lot of times it was hedge funds. So hedge funds were buying these and they were basically looking for the securities that were rated AAA. That meant that those securities were really good. But the problem here was that the mortgage companies that actually were selling these securities were just lumping all of these loans together, whether they were good or not, and calling all of them AAA. And they didn't truly care about the quality of each of these loans. They were just like, yeah, these are good to sell. AAA. And so they would sell them to these investment firms, they would sell them to these hedge funds, and they would basically just wipe their hands clean of these loans and be done with it. But the problem was that these investment firms that got them, like the hedge funds, the offices, the businesses, etc., they would hold on to them and they would look for that return on investment with interest, but on paper, they were telling a different story than what they were actually collecting from the actual people who had these loans. You see, a lot of these loans started to default because when you can't prove that you can pay this loan, generally speaking, you can't pay that loan. So a lot of the loans in this AAA rating mortgage-backed security started to default. The hedge funds that were basically holding these were trying to paint a different picture to their clients because the last thing that they want to do is go to their clients and tell them, hey, I'm losing you money. You see, I think a lot of times we think of hedge funds as these inanimate, boogeyman type people, but a lot of times they're working for people that are pouring their money into these hedge funds to further their assets and to further their growth. Hedge funds, usually there's like one person that's like managing a few different people's accounts, and they basically go put their money into the best opportunities possible, including mortgage-backed securities. These hedge funds, not wanting to admit any wrongdoing to their clients, were showing a different picture than what was actually happening behind the scenes. And once people started to catch on to this, that is what caused the big collapse that we saw. And it actually wasn't that caused the big collapse. It was actually once people found out that these mortgage-backed securities were not good and that these hedge funds had been lying about the results that they were getting, a lot of these people that were investing their money into hedge funds were likely investing in other things as well. So like the stock market, maybe they had a rental portfolio themselves, or they had other forms of investment. So they started to take their money out of everything, which caused panic buying, and other people who maybe weren't in hedge funds, but maybe had their money in other resources, to also pull their money out of those accounts. And that's trickled on top of the fact that the people who had these other loans that didn't require any kind of verification were starting to default and short sell on these properties because there was never a requirement for them to qualify in the first place. So that is what caused 2008. It was more so people trying to backtrack and trying to cover their tracks and not really be seen as, hey, we're in a bad position. That is what caused 2008. Now, the difference here and what's going on now is that what's happening now is actually being designed. It's actually being, done on purpose. This is intentional. 2008 was just like, oh crap, let me hide all my crap because I don't want anyone to know I'm doing anything wrong. Right now, this is being done because we are trying to bring interest rates back down. We're trying to get the economy back to a healthy place. So this is all by design. These tariffs and everything that's going on with the economy, that is by design. Versus 2008, which was, hey, now the dark is coming to light and we now have to deal with the consequences of that. That is why it's not quite the exact same situation in 2008. And I would actually say this is a little bit, out of left field because I don't know if this has ever been done before where we intentionally try to ruin the economy versus, the other times that it's happened, like with the Great Depression and in the 2008 recession, that's more so just the fault in people's ways when it comes to what their jobs were supposed to be. So I think that this is a completely different beast, and I'm actually very nervous about what the future of the economy looks like because, again, this is by design and it's happening at such a fast pace that I'm not sure what the result of this looks like at the end of the day, but that's how the two are different. So what can you do to better prepare you and your family for the storm that is about to hit the economy? I have a few suggestions and I would love to hear some other suggestions if you have any in the comments. But the first thing that I would recommend is look at the high interest debt that you have. Like if you have any credit card debt, and look for opportunities to bring that into a lower interest rate product. I mentioned it at the beginning, but a lot of times I used to help people with HELOCs and they would actually take the debt that they had from their high interest credit cards that were like 20-30% and put them on a HELOC that was closer to like 6-7%, save a ton of money in interest, and were able to save themselves hundreds of dollars a month because they went from paying this credit card that you don't really know when it's going to get paid off to like a home equity product that you have a good idea of, hey, this is going to be paid off by a certain date. As well, because again, you're saving hundreds of dollars of interest because you're going from an extremely high unsecured debt to a lower secured debt, you now have the opportunity to have some wiggle room in your finances with that payment difference. Another thing I would recommend is to have an emergency fund. I know that's easier said than done, especially if you're in a position where you're just living paycheck to paycheck. Like, how can you build that emergency fund? Like I mentioned, if you are taking that advice of putting your high interest debt into a low interest debt, then you should have some kind of wiggle room there. But let's just say that's not an option for you. Let's just say you've been renting and you want to start building a nest egg. That might be an opportunity for you to maybe pick up selling some things around the house. Maybe you build a second little business, a side hustle. I'm a big fan of having side hustles. I personally don't recommend having like a ton of side hustles all at one time, but if you have like a regular 9-to-5 job, what can you do additionally to help bring in some income for the short term while the economy is going through this transition period that we're currently going through? Like, I think having $1,000 is a really great place to start. Usually I would like to see somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 to 6 months, just in case you experience some of the layoffs that are going on, or maybe if your company decides to start trimming the fat, you now have some kind of security as we wait out this storm. I would just say start whatever feels comfortable with you. Even having $500 is better than having nothing in savings. So start building your emergency fund and really be intentional about the way that you use money going forward, because again, there's a lot of uncertainty going on in the economy, and the best thing that you can do to be prepared is to have resources at hand. With that being said, if you're currently a W-2 like 9-to-5 type worker, pay attention to the company around you and look at the moves that they're making, because usually things don't happen on a whim. Usually there's some kind of signs of trouble beforehand. Like if you see your company, let's just say they start firing people, or like they start making really big offenses out of very minor things. Maybe they are, losing someone and they're not immediately trying to replace them. Like, these are all signs that your company might be trying to trim the fat as well. Just pay attention to your personal job security and see if there's strange things going on here that can't be explained. Are they trying to get rid of people? What is the general sentiment around their staff? Like, are they welcoming us to be here? Or are they trying to kind of pick out who they want to keep and who they don't want to keep? Pay attention to your surroundings while you're at this job and see like, hey, do I think that this might be happening here soon. And you would be amazed. So some final thoughts. I know that this time right now in the economy is a little bit scary because we're not quite sure where this is going to go. I think, I hate this saying as much as everyone does, but we truly are in unprecedented times and we don't know where the next move might be. And so the best thing that you can do is be prepared. And so if you've made it to the end of this video, then you are probably more prepared than most people are going to be as we head into this financial storm that is happening here soon. But that doesn't mean that you have the action steps needed to actually be prepared. So, if you're watching this, take those steps that I mentioned in the last section and start building out what you need to be prepared as the economy gets scarier from here. Because I don't think this is Armageddon. I don't think this is doomsday, but I do think that there is going to be a lot of people that are put out by this financial crisis that we're about to go through. We haven't quite declared that we're in a recession yet, but I do think that we pretty much are. So the most that you can do to set yourself up and your family for success, I think, is the best thing that you could do at this point in the journey that we're at. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please make sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video maybe with someone who needs this information as well. I hope to see you guys in the next one. Bye!